Naomi did not blink, but something behind her stillness carried history, the kind that did not announce itself, yet shaped every inch of how she stood, how she breathed, how she refused to shrink under pressure that would have bent most people long before this moment. The faint reflection of the patrol lights traced along the curve of her cheek, catching on a small, nearly invisible scar near her temple, a mark that did not belong to this place, this parking lot, or this night. It belonged somewhere else entirely, somewhere louder, harsher, where silence meant something very different. Years earlier, Naomi Carter had stood in deserts where the air shimmered under 110-degree heat, where every step had to be measured, where every sound mattered. She had learned to listen to the smallest shifts, the way wind moved differently across open ground, the way stillness could signal more than motion ever could. She had learned to trust what could not be seen. And more importantly, she had learned not to react to fear the way most people did. Back then, she had not been alone. There had always been movement at her side, disciplined, precise, responsive not to chaos but to intention. That kind of partnership did not disappear when the uniform came off. It stayed in the way she carried herself, in the quiet confidence that did not need to be proven out loud. Harlan did not know any of that. To him, Naomi was just a woman standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, someone who was not following instructions fast enough, someone who challenged the order he believed he maintained. His world was built on quick judgments, on reading situations in seconds and acting before doubt could interfere. That system had worked for him for years, reinforced by routine, by repetition, by the unspoken assumption that control meant safety. He shifted his weight slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied her again, trying to find something that justified the tension building in his chest. "You are not giving me a lot of options here," he said, his voice steady but tighter now, like a line pulled just a little too far. Naomi's gaze softened, not in surrender, but in understanding. She had seen this before, not just in one man, but in many, the need to assert authority before understanding context, the instinct to fill silence with commands instead of questions. "You always have options," she replied, her tone even, almost reflective, as if she were speaking to a student instead of a man holding power over the moment. One of the officers behind Harlan shifted again, glancing toward Naomi with a flicker of uncertainty that did not go unnoticed. The radio on his shoulder crackled with a distant dispatch call, words half-heard, unrelated, but grounding in their normalcy. Life was still moving beyond this pocket of tension, even if it did not feel like it here. Naomi's eyes briefly lowered, not in submission, but in calculation, in awareness of everything around her. The angle of the vehicles, the distance between bodies, the rhythm of breath, hers and theirs. She lifted her gaze again, meeting Harlan's stare without resistance. "You are reading this wrong," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not forceful, not urgent, just certain. Harlan exhaled through his nose, a slow release that betrayed the first hint of hesitation. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. The kind of crack that only appeared when something did not align the way it was supposed to. The lights continued to pulse, steady, unrelenting, reflecting off the dark windows of the closed storefront behind Naomi. For a brief second, in that mirrored surface, her silhouette stood not alone, but layered with something else, something unseen yet present, something that belonged to a different world than the one Harlan thought he controlled. And in that reflection, the balance of the moment had already begun to shift, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The night did not move forward, it tightened, drawing every sound into sharper focus as if the world itself had leaned in to listen. And in that narrowing space, Sergeant Harlan felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his certainty, not fear, not yet, but something quieter, something that did not belong in a situation he thought he understood completely. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, but there was a shift in the air around her, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift that only registered if you knew what to listen for, and she did. She heard the difference before anyone else did. A faint disturbance carried low across the asphalt, not loud enough to draw attention, but precise enough to register in the part of her mind that had never stopped being trained to detect it. Her breathing stayed steady, her expression calm, but her awareness expanded, reaching beyond the immediate circle of flashing lights and uniformed figures, touching something just outside their perception. Harlan followed her gaze for a fraction of a second, but saw nothing, just the dark outline of a parked utility truck at the far edge of the lot, its shadow stretching long under the dim glow of a distant lamp. He dismissed it quickly, pulling his attention back to her, grounding himself in what he could control. "Last chance," he said again, though this time the words did not land with the same weight, as if the moment itself had shifted just enough to take something out of his voice. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, listening, not to him, but to something else entirely. The officers behind Harlan exchanged brief glances, their stances tightening, sensing the change without understanding it. One of them adjusted his grip on his radio, the plastic clicking softly against his vest, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The wind brushed lightly across the lot, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and metal, and beneath that, something else, something alive, something disciplined. Naomi's eyes softened for the briefest moment, not with emotion, but with recognition. She did not move her feet, did not raise her hands, did not break the stillness she had maintained from the beginning, but something inside her aligned, like a switch flipping into place. Harlan noticed the change, even if he could not define it. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice sharper now, trying to reclaim control over a moment that no longer felt entirely his. Naomi met his eyes again, steady, grounded, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something behind her calm, not defiance, not anger, but certainty. "Not everything shows up when you expect it to," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without rising above the steady hum of engines and radios. The words hung there, simple, almost cryptic, but they landed with a weight that pressed into the silence. Harlan frowned slightly, his instincts pulling in two directions at once, one telling him to push forward, to assert control, the other whispering that something was unfolding just beyond his understanding. The reflection in the storefront glass shifted again as the lights pulsed, and for a brief moment, the shape behind Naomi's silhouette seemed to ripple, as if the darkness itself had taken form. One of the officers took a half step back without realizing it, his boot scraping softly against the pavement. No one spoke. No one moved forward. The space between them stretched tighter, thinner, charged with something that had not been there seconds before. Naomi remained still at the center of it, her presence no longer just passive resistance, but something deeper, something rooted, something that did not bend to pressure because it had been forged in places where pressure was constant. And in that quiet, unseen moment, whatever was coming had already crossed the threshold, even if no one but her had fully recognized it yet. The sound came again, clearer this time, not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, rhythmic, like something moving with purpose rather than reaction, and Naomi's posture shifted just a fraction, not enough for most to notice, but enough to signal that whatever she had sensed before was now closer, now undeniable. Sergeant Harlan heard it too, though his mind struggled to categorize it, his instincts searching for something familiar to attach it to, something that fit within the boundaries of his training, but this did not arrive like a threat, it arrived like precision. "Hold position," he called out to the officers behind him, his voice firmer now, attempting to anchor the moment before it slipped further out of reach. The men responded automatically, their movements tightening, their focus narrowing, but their eyes flicked toward the dark edge of the lot, toward the shadow near the parked truck where the sound had begun to form into something tangible. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxed, her stance grounded, and then, without raising her voice, without stepping forward or back, she made a sound so soft it barely seemed to exist at all, a single, controlled whistle that cut through the tension not by force, but by familiarity. It was not loud, not sharp, but it carried, precise in its tone, deliberate in its timing, and the effect was immediate, though not explosive, not chaotic, just exact. From the edge of the darkness, two shapes moved into the light, low and fluid, their motion synchronized, their pace measured, not rushing, not hesitating, but advancing with a kind of discipline that did not need to prove itself. The officers stiffened, their attention snapping toward the movement, but no one stepped forward, no one broke formation, because what they were seeing did not match the uncertainty they had been preparing for. The animals emerged fully into the glow of the patrol lights, their coats catching flashes of red and blue, their eyes alert but steady, scanning, assessing, not reacting. They moved past the line of sight where most would have stopped, closing the distance between themselves and Naomi with quiet certainty. And then they stopped, positioning themselves at her sides with a precision that spoke of training far beyond anything casual or uncontrolled. One stood slightly ahead, angled just enough to observe the officers directly, while the other remained half a step back, aligned with Naomi's posture, as if reading her without needing instruction. There was no barking, no lunging, no sudden movement, only presence, grounded and unmistakable. Harlan's breath caught for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but in recognition that something fundamental about the situation had changed. His eyes dropped, almost instinctively, to the collars, to the small patches affixed with clean stitching, the kind that did not belong to civilian ownership, the kind that carried meaning in circles he had only brushed against in briefings and reports. The nearest officer shifted again, his stance loosening just slightly as uncertainty replaced assumption. "Are those?" he started, but did not finish, because the answer was already forming in the silence around them. Naomi did not move, did not speak immediately, but the presence at her sides changed the space entirely, not by escalating it, but by redefining it. The power that had seemed one-sided minutes ago now balanced on a different axis, one that did not rely on raised voices or visible authority. Harlan lowered his chin slightly, eyes narrowing as he recalibrated, his training now working to catch up with what his instincts had missed. "You did not mention you were not alone," he said, his tone quieter, more measured, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt something he was only beginning to understand. Naomi's gaze remained steady, her voice calm when she finally responded. "I am not," she said, the words simple, but anchored in something far deeper than the moment itself. The lights continued to pulse, the radios continued to hum, but the tension had shifted completely, no longer pressing down on her, but suspended between all of them, waiting for someone to decide what came next. No one moved, but everything changed, the kind of shift that did not announce itself with noise, only with weight, pressing into the air until even the smallest sound felt deliberate, measured, watched. The two dogs remained still at Naomi's sides, their posture calm yet unmistakably alert, their presence not aggressive, not reactive, but anchored, like they had been placed there with purpose rather than impulse. One of them tilted its head slightly, ears forward, eyes tracking movement with quiet precision, not just the closest figure, but all of them, mapping the space in a way that made the officers suddenly aware of how exposed their positions were. Sergeant Harlan's gaze lingered on the patch again, the stitching crisp, the insignia unmistakable now that his mind had caught up with what his eyes had seen seconds earlier. It was not just a symbol, it was a credential, one that did not need to be announced to carry authority. He swallowed once, subtle, controlled, but enough to register the recalibration happening behind his composed exterior. "Military trained," he said under his breath, not quite a question, not quite a statement, more like a realization spoken aloud because it demanded acknowledgement. The officer beside him shifted his weight, glancing between Naomi and the dogs, uncertainty creeping into his stance. "Sergeant, should we?" he started, but the words trailed off, unfinished, because the usual next step did not feel as clear as it had moments ago. Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, her attention divided yet centered, aware of every detail without appearing to focus on any single one. She did not need to give commands, did not need to gesture, because the connection at her sides was already established, already understood. The dogs did not look at her for direction, they did not need to. Their alignment with her was already complete, built on something deeper than a moment's instruction. Harlan took a small step back, not a retreat, but a repositioning, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement, the sound sharper now in the tightened silence. "Why are they here?" he asked, his tone no longer edged with command, but edged with caution, as if the question itself required careful handling. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her voice carried a quiet certainty that settled into the space between them. "Because I am," she said, the answer simple, direct, and heavier than its words suggested. The radio on Harlan's shoulder crackled again, a dispatcher's voice cutting through briefly with routine information, something about a traffic stop miles away, something normal, something that belonged to a world that felt distant from this one. He did not respond immediately, his attention still fixed on Naomi, on the animals, on the realization that the situation he had thought he understood was built on incomplete information. One of the officers lowered his hand slightly, not dropping his readiness, but easing it, the tension in his posture softening just enough to signal the shift spreading. Through the group, the dogs remained motionless, their presence steady, their restraint more powerful than any sudden movement could have been, because it showed control, discipline, and tension. Harlan exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but deliberate, as if releasing the last of an assumption that no longer held. "You could have said something earlier," he muttered, though the words lacked the force of accusation, carrying instead the weight of recognition that the moment had unfolded in a way he had not anticipated. Naomi's eyes softened slightly, not in concession, but in clarity. "You did not ask," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not sharp, just true. The words settled into the silence, and no one contradicted them, because there was nothing to contradict. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, but the urgency they once carried had faded, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate, as if the night itself had shifted from confrontation to understanding without ever raising its voice. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a held breath that no one wanted to release too quickly, as if breaking it might undo the fragile balance that had just been restored. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, but they no longer dominated the space. They simply existed within it, reduced from symbols of urgency to background noise against something far more grounded. Naomi stood where she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, but now the stillness around her carried a different meaning, no longer resistance, no longer tension, but quiet control. The dogs remained at her sides, their focus unwavering, their bodies relaxed but ready, embodying the same restraint that defined her, the same discipline that did not need to prove itself through motion. A faint breeze moved across the lot, lifting a loose piece of paper near the curb, sending it skimming softly along the pavement before it settled again, the sound barely audible, yet clear in the absence of raised voices. Sergeant Harlan lowered his shoulders slightly, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid, as if the weight he had been carrying had shifted, redistributed into something he could finally process. His eyes moved from Naomi to the dogs and back again, slower now, more intentional, taking in details he had overlooked before, the stitching on the collars, the posture, the alignment, the quiet confidence that did not belong to uncertainty. He reached up and pressed the button on his radio, his voice measured, controlled, but different now, stripped of the urgency it had carried earlier. "Dispatch, situation is under control," he said, each word placed carefully, as if acknowledging more than just the moment itself. There was a brief pause before the response came through, routine, distant, unaware of the shift that had just taken place in this small corner of the night. "Copy that," the dispatcher replied, and the line went quiet again. One of the officers behind him exhaled, a sound that had been held back without notice, his stance loosening, his grip easing, the tension leaving his shoulders in a slow, almost reluctant release. Another officer glanced at Naomi, then at the dogs, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as if reassessing everything he had assumed when he first stepped out of the patrol car. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, her awareness still wide, still present, but no longer braced against pressure. She shifted her weight just enough to settle more comfortably, a small movement that marked the end of something without announcing it. The nearest dog mirrored the shift, adjusting its stance by inches, maintaining alignment without needing instruction, the kind of connection that spoke louder than any command ever could. Harlan took a slow breath, the air cooler now against his skin, clearer somehow, as if the tension that had filled it had dissipated into something lighter. "You handled that well," he said after a moment. The words quiet, almost reluctant, but sincere in a way that did not require emphasis. Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady, her voice calm when she responded. "So did you," she said, not as praise, not as concession, but as recognition of a moment that could have gone differently and did not. The words settled between them, simple, but carrying weight in their honesty. The lights from the patrol cars flickered once more, then dimmed slightly as one engine powered down, the hum softening into the background, the scene returning to something closer to ordinary, though it would not feel that way to any of them for a while. The night resumed its quiet rhythm, distant traffic, the faint buzz of streetlights, the subtle sounds of a world that had continued moving even as this moment had stood still. Naomi turned her head slightly, not away, but forward, her focus shifting beyond the circle of officers, beyond the lights, toward whatever came next. The dogs remained at her sides, steady, present, not as a shield, not as a statement, but as part of something deeper, something built long before this night and unchanged by it. And in that quiet, without any need for further words, the moment closed, not with finality, but with understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be felt. The moment did not end with movement. It deepened, settling into something quieter, something that carried weight beyond the immediate scene. And as the engines idled lower and the lights softened, Sergeant Harlan felt the shift reach further than the parking lot, reaching into the assumptions he had carried long before this night began. He looked at Naomi again, not as a subject of control, not as a variable to manage, but as someone who had stood through the tension without raising her voice, without escalating, without stepping outside of herself even when everything around her had tried to force a reaction. His eyes dropped once more to the dogs, to the way they held their position without strain, without restlessness, the kind of composure that came from repetition, from discipline shaped over time, not improvised in the moment. He had seen trained units before, during joint exercises, briefings, demonstrations, but this was different. This was not a display, not a controlled environment. This was real, and it carried a clarity that those settings never quite captured. "You served," he said after a moment, not as a question, but as something he had pieced together from fragments, from posture, from presence, from the way everything around her aligned without visible effort. Naomi did not nod immediately, did not confirm or deny with urgency. She simply held his gaze, then gave the smallest acknowledgement, a subtle inclination of her head that said enough without expanding further. "A long time ago," she replied, her voice even, her tone carrying neither pride nor dismissal, just fact. The officer beside Harlan shifted slightly, glancing at her with a new kind of attention, one that replaced assumption with recognition, even if incomplete. "K-9 unit," he added quietly, more to himself than anyone else, as if filling in the rest of a picture he had only just begun to see. Naomi's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, not in reaction to the words themselves, but to the understanding behind them, partial though it was. Harlan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, as if releasing something that had been held too tightly. "We got a call," he said, his voice steadier now, more grounded. "Report of suspicious activity in the area." He paused, then added, "Someone said there was a woman pacing between vehicles." The words hung there, simple, procedural, but stripped now of the certainty they had carried earlier. Naomi glanced briefly toward the row of parked cars, the quiet line of empty spaces, the shadows stretching long between them, and then back to him. "I was waiting," she said, her tone calm, unguarded, "for a transport pickup that was running late." Harlan nodded slowly, the pieces aligning, the situation reshaping itself into something far less charged than it had seemed minutes ago. "And the dogs," he said, his eyes flicking toward them again, not with suspicion now, but with curiosity grounded in respect. Naomi's gaze followed his briefly, then returned. "They stay with me," she said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of trust built over time, always. The nearest dog shifted its stance by a fraction, adjusting to her movement, its focus still outward, still attentive, but relaxed in a way that spoke of familiarity rather than alertness alone. One of the officers behind Harlan lowered his radio completely now, his posture no longer braced, His attention settled into observation rather than readiness. The tension that had once defined the scene had dissolved into something else entirely, something quieter, more reflective. Harlan ran a hand briefly along the edge of his belt, a small, grounding motion, then looked back at Naomi with a different expression, one that carried not authority, not control, but acknowledgement. "We read it wrong," he said, the admission direct, unembellished, and heavier for its simplicity. Naomi did not respond immediately, did not rush to fill the space his words created. She simply met his gaze, her expression steady, her presence unchanged. "It happens," she said after a moment, her tone neither dismissive nor sharp, just real, just grounded in a truth that extended beyond this night. The words settled between them, and this time, there was no tension in the silence that followed, only understanding, quiet and complete, the kind that did not need to be reinforced to remain. The air no longer pressed down on anyone. It opened, wide and breathable, and with that shift came something quieter, something heavier than tension had been, something closer to reflection, and Sergeant Harlan felt it settle into his chest in a way that did not come from training manuals or procedures, but from something far more human. He glanced at the officers behind him, reading their posture the same way he had read Naomi earlier, noticing the eased shoulders, the lowered hands, the absence of urgency that had once defined their stance. The moment had changed them too, even if they had not spoken it out loud. He turned back to Naomi, his gaze steady now, not searching for threat, not measuring control, but meeting her where she stood, grounded and unshaken. "I am going to clear this," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, each word placed with care, as if correcting something that mattered beyond paperwork. He stepped slightly to the side, creating space, not symbolic, not exaggerated, just real, a shift in position that acknowledged what had already changed between them. Naomi noticed, not with surprise, but with quiet recognition, the kind that did not need to be acknowledged with words. The dogs at her sides adjusted subtly as she shifted her weight, their movement smooth, synchronized, their attention still outward but no longer braced, no longer holding the same edge of readiness. One of the officers took a slow breath and glanced toward Harlan, waiting for direction, but not out of tension now, out of routine, out of a system that was recalibrating in real time. Harlan gave a small nod, barely perceptible, but enough. "We are done here," he said, his tone even, not dismissive, not abrupt, just final in the way that closed the loop without reopening it. The officer nearest the second patrol car reached in and powered down another set of lights, and the lot dimmed further, the colors fading until only a soft glow remained, reflecting faintly off the windshields and the quiet line of parked vehicles. Naomi watched the change, her expression calm, her posture steady, but there was a subtle release in the way her shoulders settled, the way her breath moved just a little more freely, as if the space itself had given something back to her that it had taken at the start. Harlan hesitated for a brief moment, then spoke again, his voice lower now, more personal, stripped of the distance it had carried earlier. "I should have asked first," he said, not as a formality, not as something rehearsed, but as something realized in the space between assumption and understanding. Naomi met his eyes, her gaze steady, her voice soft but clear when she answered. "And I could have said more," she replied, not as a concession, not as an apology, but as a shared acknowledgement that moments like this were rarely one-sided. The honesty in the exchange settled into the night like something tangible, something that did not erase what had happened, but reframed it, gave it a different weight, a different meaning. One of the officers glanced at Naomi again, then at the dogs, his expression thoughtful, as if he would carry this moment with him long after the lights had faded completely. Harlan straightened slightly, not rigid, but composed, and gave a small, respectful nod, the kind that did not need to be announced to be. "Understood." Naomi returned it with the slightest movement of her head, her presence unchanged, grounded, whole. The engines quieted further, the hum lowering into the background until it blended with the distant sounds of the city, and for a brief second, the parking lot felt almost still, almost untouched by what had just unfolded. Naomi turned slightly, her focus shifting forward, toward the edge of the lot where the darkness met the open road, and the dogs moved with her, their steps silent, measured, aligned with hers without hesitation. Behind her, the officers remained where they were, no longer forming a barrier, no longer holding a line, just standing, watching, understanding settling in without words. And as Naomi walked, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed, like something had been corrected, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would linger long after the night moved on. Naomi's footsteps were quiet against the pavement, measured and steady, each one carrying her farther from the circle of light that had once held her in place. And as she moved, the night seemed to open around her, no longer confined to flashing colors and controlled voices, but stretching outward into something vast and ordinary again. The two dogs stayed perfectly aligned at her sides, their movement fluid, their pace matching hers without effort, their presence no longer a statement, no longer a shift in power, but simply part of her, as natural as the rhythm of her breath. Behind her, the last of the patrol lights dimmed further, the glow fading until it barely touched the edges of the lot, leaving only the soft hum of engines cooling and the distant sound of traffic threading through the city beyond. Sergeant Harlan did not move right away. He stood where he was, watching her walk, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by command, but by something quieter, something reflective. The officers near him remained still as well, their attention following the same path, not out of suspicion, not out of duty, but out of understanding that had settled without being forced. Harlan's gaze lingered on the way Naomi carried herself, the way she did not look back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left to resolve behind her. He let out a slow breath, the air cooler now, clearer, and for the first time since the moment had begun, he allowed the silence to exist without trying to fill it. One of the younger officers shifted beside him, glancing up as if about to speak, but then stopped, the words dissolving before they formed, because whatever needed to be said had already been understood. Harlan's eyes dropped briefly to the ground, to the faint marks left by their boots, the subtle disturbances in the dust that would disappear by morning, leaving no visible trace of what had happened here, and yet he knew the moment would not fade as easily. It had settled somewhere deeper, somewhere that would remain long after the lot returned to its usual emptiness. He lifted his gaze again, just as Naomi reached the edge of the pavement, where the light gave way to shadow, where the defined lines of the parking spaces blurred into the open stretch of road beyond. She paused there for a fraction of a second, not hesitating, not uncertain, just present, her outline framed against the darker horizon. One of the dogs turned its head slightly, scanning the distance ahead, while the other remained focused forward, both of them moving only when she did, as if guided by something unspoken yet absolute. Then she stepped forward again, crossing that invisible boundary without effort, without ceremony, and the darkness received her not as something unknown, but as something familiar. The officers behind her remained where they were, no longer part of her path, no longer influencing the direction of her movement. Harlan watched until her figure became smaller, until the details blurred into silhouette, until the steady rhythm of her steps blended with the quiet sounds of the night. He did not call out, did not attempt to hold the moment in place, because he understood now that it was not his to hold. The space she left behind felt different, not empty, but settled, as if something had been realigned without needing to be declared. The last engine,